Through my work, I intend to bring to attention issues that affect the working class. The issue I highlight with this paper is gentrification, focusing specifically on the Denver area. After careful consideration of medium and concept, I made the decision to create a satirical travel guide that emphasizes the deceitful nature of the development and gentrification. Taking into account the history of travel writing and photography, as well as that of satire and art, I have put together a travel guide that uses irony, as well as the juxtaposition of a cheerful design and warmly colored photographs with the grim reality of gentrification, to communicate a message about the dark side of purported progress and development. My hope is that the project not only communicates the inconsistencies and misleading nature of progress, but also that it demonstrates art's ability to educate and enact change. For this work, I wanted to find a way to apply photography knowledge as well as design to communicate the message about gentrification, using Denver as a primary example. My journey with this topic has consisted of various iterations. It began with my exploration of urban photography through the city of Denver. As I walked through the city, I searched for trends, signs that were indicators of the urban condition in Denver. In exploring Denver and attempting to practice urban photography, I found a striking number of abandoned buildings that were once thriving businesses, now available for rent. This got me to think about the constant change associated with urban life. I realized that these abandoned storefronts and restaurants were visual representations of the toll that gentrification can take among long-standing residents of the city. The series quickly expanded and evolved, and I noticed that though each area is definitely impacted by gentrification, it manifests in a different way depending on multiple factors. I began to research major neighborhoods in Denver and settled on Highland, River North Arts District, Five Points, and Capitol Hill, focusing on not only closed-down businesses, but construction sites, historical landmarks, and housing. Through photographing each of these and compiling the photographs, the impact of gentrification in Denver and at large became clear in a more tangible way. In order to understand the purpose and function of this project, the definition of and theories surrounding gentrification are important to consider. The term was first coined by British Marxist sociologist Ruth Glass in 1964. Glass was a pioneer of urbanism in Europe, and she coined the term out of a need for an explanation of the changes occurring in London during that time. Gentrification comes from the English term gentry, which the Oxford Dictionary defines as people of good social position, specifically the class of people next below the nobility in position and birth. Thus, gentrification literally means the taking over of a specific area or population with the gentry. Clearly, at its inception, the terminology of gentrification was rooted in displacement as well as in class distinction. A precursor to the more modern ideas of gentrification is the Haussmannization of Paris, which displaced poor residents from the centers of Paris through the demolition of the residential areas. In the United States, gentrification began post-war, with the advent of advanced capitalist cities, focusing mainly in larger cosmopolitan areas such as New York City, Washington, D.C., and Boston. After the war, urban renewal became a focus, and this meant the destruction of existing neighborhoods and their replacement with more modern ones. Post-war, gentrification was met with fervent opposition from the working class. As times change and society continues to evolve and progress, the definition of gentrification does as well. Gentrifiers themselves often consider gentrification to be synonymous with revitalization, bringing to life decaying neighborhoods. Those opposed to gentrification, in particular the long-standing residents of gentrifying or gentrified neighborhoods, as well as those relocated by it, associate it more with displacement and loss. Modernism implies that change and development are important for the success and prosperity of an area, and it is true that many gentrified areas have a history of extreme poverty. However, more often than not, these developments displace the existing residents, doing nothing to combat the real issues existing in these areas and the systems that made these issues possible. In my guide, I highlight 4 prominent neighborhoods in Denver: RiNo, Lohi, Capitol Hill, and Five Points. Each one is victim to gentrification, and this shows in different ways. The differences lie primarily in the age of the neighborhoods, as well as the time periods in which they began to gentrify. Five Points is perhaps the most well-known example. Five Points is located northeast of downtown. It gets its name from its intersection. When Inc. Coffee sparked national outrage in 2017 because of an unabashedly pro-gentrification sign, the topic of displacement and its meaning to Denver's longtime population became much more prominent in urbanist discourse. This occurred in the River North Arts District, more commonly referred to as RiNo. The Inc. Coffee controversy particularly speaks to the negative effects that gentrification has on existing communities, in particular when they are communities of color. Five Points has a rich history in the African American community in Denver. For many decades, the majority of the population was Black and was hugely important in the jazz music community. In the early 21st century, the demographic of Five Points endured a dramatic shift, with the Black population decreasing by about 20%. The population has continued to shift as money has been invested into the redevelopment of Five Points, attracting more affluent newcomers and displacing existing residents who could no longer afford to pay their rent. Five Points is perhaps one of the most blatantly and recognizably gentrifying neighborhoods in Denver. RiNo, co-founded by Tracy Whale and Jill Hadley Hooper, was created in an industrial area comprised mostly of warehouses. RiNo is located north of the South Platte River. It is part of 4 historic neighborhoods: Globeville, Five Points, Cole, and Elyria Swansea. In RiNo, one of the primary attractions is Crush Walls. Crush Walls is a once-a-year mural festival in which local, national, and international artists showcase their art through murals painted on the many walls of RiNo's establishments. This event is a clear representation of the way in which gentrification manifests in this particular area. It is often the case that art and gentrification are intimately connected, and this is particularly evident in the use of mural art. Denver graffiti and street artist Jolt refers to murals as wallpaper for gentrification. Artists produce work that contributes to the development or revitalization of an area, and that contributes to its appeal to affluent newcomers. However, due to high rent prices that these new residents are able to pay, artists themselves are barred from living in the areas that they beautify. Another neighborhood explored in this body of work is Highland. Highland is comprised of 2 separate neighborhoods, which are Highland and West Highland. Highland overlooks downtown Denver and is bound by West 38th Avenue to the north and Spear Boulevard to the south. This area is also referred to as North Side, which is the more common name for it among longtime residents and older generations. Highland is a rapidly gentrifying area of Denver, with its southern portion being referred to by the trendy moniker Lohi for Lower Highland. Though the rapid shifts are relatively recent, a combination of seemingly disconnected events throughout its history have led to its current status as a trendy neighborhood for newcomers. Of all the studied neighborhoods, this is likely the one that has been noticeably gentrifying for the longest amount of time, and this is particularly evident in the study of public spaces within this area. One such space is Columbus Park, renamed La Raza Park by Chicano residents. Currently, particularly in the Lohi region, we see the north side being redesigned and rendered a trendy space for out-of-town renters and homebuyers. Hotspots in Highland today include mortuary-turned-restaurant Linger, as well as the famous bucket-shaped Little Man ice cream. These locales embody the new neighborhood vibe Highlands is known for among newcomers. Essentially, public spaces are used as a way to attract newcomers while simultaneously ignoring and even deliberately erasing what existed before it and the communities that built this space. The final neighborhood explored in this project is Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill is bounded by Downing Street, Colfax Avenue, Broadway, and 7th Avenue. Being a historical neighborhood, gentrification in Capitol Hill manifests differently than it does in a newly developed area such as RiNo. The neighborhood contains historic mansions dating back to the 1920s. Similarly to the other neighborhoods discussed, Capitol Hill was formerly fairly run down, but was revitalized and became a hub for bohemians and artists. The old-style architecture is unique, and there is a wide variety of color and style in buildings. Capitol Hill maintains small businesses that reflect its days as a more bohemian neighborhood, such as Vinyl Store Wax Tracks and vegetarian hotspots City-O City and Watercourse. In the case of Capitol Hill, the vintage aesthetic of the neighborhood is part of its appeal, and this attracts newcomers, similarly to the other neighborhoods discussed. For the creation of my travel guide, I decided to delve into the form of satire, using travel writing and photography as template, and to use this to represent the 4 previously discussed areas in Denver. The history of travel photography, literature, and guides is important to note because it provides insight into the evolution of the genre and provides the context necessary to create a project based on it. It is important to note that at its inception, travel photography was focused mainly on international travel, which is evidently not the concentration of this project. For centuries prior to the advent of photography, people had to rely on the descriptions given by explorers who traveled to other countries. Landscape paintings also provided some insight into what other countries looked like. The pioneer of travel photography existed in the mid-19th century. These photographers had to carry extremely heavy and expensive equipment to their voyages. During this time, travel and photography were both only accessible to the leisure class. It wasn't until the invention and the rise of Kodak that photography became accessible to the general public. Kodak cameras were able to produce 100 exposures, and this did not necessitate the lugging of heavy, impractical chemicals and materials. After this point, photography, and by extension, travel photography, became much more mainstream. Since then, travel photography has evolved into something completely different. A travel guide is a combination of travel photography with text, providing information on the location being described. It generally includes landmarks and attractions, and is made to provide the tourist with locales and activities to render the trip interesting and successful. The earliest versions of the modern travel guides were created in the 1830s, as the market for tourism began to increase. British author John Murray published Murray's Handbook for Travelers, and this is the first known example that has influenced travel guides as they are known today. This is an early, concrete example of tourism being capitalized on. In addition to researching travel photography and literature, the history and definition of satire are relevant information in the creation of a work such as this one. Satire exists in many forms and is often a component of artistic practices, particularly in reference to modern art. According to Deirdre de Klerk, satire is defined as, quote, a genre which since Roman times has guided the interpretation and evaluation of works on the ground of their purpose to critique and entertain, unquote. Satire functions as a critique of certain aspects of society. Irony and humor in art gained prominence during the Dada movement in the early 20th century. Marcel Duchamp was a pioneer of satirical art during this time, and this occurred in conjunction with the rise of new technologies. As Peter Marzio asserts, quote, the comic can no longer spur the impossible in an age of limitless achievement, and the artist has inherited a whole new range of subject matter that refuses to lend itself to the aesthetic rules of the past. The result has been a curious meld of art and humor." Unquote. The advent of satire in art occurred in tandem with the shifting definition of art and the increased appreciation of concept over aesthetic. Following Duchamp, many artists use satirical elements in their work, often using irony, humor, and juxtaposition to communicate a message regarding relevant socio-political issues. The art of satire has evolved and expanded, ranging from high art to much more mainstream media. Perhaps the most prominent example of mainstream contemporary satirical media is the publication The Onion. This is a publication that uses fake headlines and fully written fabricated news stories that satirize the well-known newspaper format to expose truth through comedy and exaggeration. Online publications such as Clickhole and Reductress have followed suit. Due to the nature of this project, it is important to elaborate on the connection being made between travel guides and gentrification, and why I believe this connection to be valid enough to warrant the creation of a satirical piece. Tourism and gentrification are connected because it is often through the advertisement of various areas for tourism that people are encouraged to visit them, and therefore gain interest in moving to these areas. The history of travel guides is largely international, but in recent decades, local tourism has become much more common. Both travel and gentrification are also deeply intertwined with the capitalist society, as locations are advertised and commodified to generate increased revenue from the public. The goal for this project was to expand on previous research and series regarding the topic of gentrification, and to present it in a new, more intentional form. When I created my first iteration of this book, it was not intended to be a satire, but rather an informative photo book exposing often hidden truths about urban life. After completing it, I realized that the topic would lend itself well to a more satirical style, as satire is often intended to expose underlying truths about society through humor and over-exaggeration. At first, a catalog or advertisement format appeared to be the most effective way to communicate this message, but upon further research, the travel guide format was the best option. Using the conventions of travel writing, photography, and design, combined with satire, would allow for an accessible understanding of the issue and its often overlooked implications. Satirical Travel Guide of Denver is divided into 4 sections, one for each neighborhood or area explored. It begins with a more serious introduction that functions as an artist statement. This way, the viewer can enter the work with a broad understanding of the message it communicates. In creating this work, there were many different aspects that required consideration, in particular pertaining to the aesthetic of this guide. Photography, design, and body copy were the main areas of focus in the creation of an effective and unified body of work. These photographs were the first area I chose to consider, because all previous iterations of this project had been almost entirely focused on the photographic aspect. In researching the history of travel guides as well as consuming them through both physical copies and websites, I noticed that the modern-day travel photography has a fairly consistent aesthetic that often consists of vibrant colors and an emphasis on lightness rather than darkness. Travel guides also tend to include images from a variety of angles and perspectives. In terms of design, I primarily referenced often visited websites such as Travel and Leisure, as well as print travel guides made by Lonely Planet and similar companies. In the modern day, online guides are common, and Instagram is a typical platform for travel photography. It is important to consider every aspect of how places are most effectively advertised to appeal to the viewer. For this guide, I edited the photographs in similar ways to make the book consistent throughout. I slightly increased vibrance of certain colors, namely blues and yellows, as these appear to be the most consistently vibrant colors in travel guides. My primary inspiration for this was the Travel and Leisure website. Color palette is also a major aspect of modern travel literature. Palettes for travel guides tend to avoid dark colors in favor of light colors that could elicit feelings of adventure and inspiration. Blue is the color that is perhaps most frequently, consistently, and intentionally used in travel photography and design. It creates feelings of adventure and is often associated with vast landscapes, including the ocean and the sky. The color palette of this body of work consists of various shades of blue, as well as shades of its complementary color, orange, and shades of pink. I also focused on gathering colors from the photographs, as each part of town has a unique color palette that would be emphasized in a travel guide. For example, the Rhino portion of the guide is largely pink and blue, because those were colors present in the Love This City mural that is often associated with Rhino. Finally, the layout and type design of this book were important to consider. I wanted it to have a large number of images that were reasonably balanced with text. I opted for a fairly simplistic design that utilized my chosen color palette and settled on a simple, readable sans serif font called Montserrat for both the body text and the image captions. For my titles and headings, I used Playfair Display, which is a commonly used serif font. These typefaces are similar to what I observed when studying the Travel and Leisure website. The headings were generally serif, while the body text and photo captions were sans serif. The most significant aspect of the text portion is its content, which is how the viewer of the work understands its satirical nature. The research on satire was essential to successfully execute the completed travel guide, as the meaning and uses of satire are important to understand in order to create it. Taking note of the definition of satire and in particular its function as a critique, I focused on creating body copy that evidently criticized this aspect of society, focusing largely on headlines and captions. The visual cues indicating a travel guide format are combined with blatantly over-the-top and slightly absurd text that uses travel writing conventions to create a unified work. In conclusion, is a satirical travel guide intended to shed light on the current state of Denver, focusing on neighborhoods in central Denver. The travel guide focuses on urban development and its negative, often overlooked effects, and uses the issue of gentrification to highlight broader issues within a capitalist society. Using a combination of research on urban theory and gentrification, focusing on the city of Denver, travel photography literature, and satire as an art form, I have created a book that communicates the unspoken reality under the guise of progress and development.